I am preparing for a PhD entrance exam to New Testament studies. And what I've been doing with this series of videos is creating videos of each book of the New Testament and kind of the most hotly debated topic about each book. Most of it is entry-level stuff, entry-level in the sense of this is the kind of thing you would learn in a master's degree program for New Testament studies, and they expect you to know it going into the PhD. So the question that I'm answering in this video is, who wrote the Luke, Acts books? Luke and Acts, all scholars agree. I say all, I'm sure there's someone out there who doesn't agree, but almost everyone unanimously says Luke and Acts were written by the same author. But the question is, who's that author? Was it actually Luke, the traveling companion of Paul? And was Luke even a traveling companion of Paul, or was it someone else? So that's what we're going to tackle today. And the way that we're going to go about that is, first we're going to look at the internal evidence, then we're going to look at the external evidence, and then we're going to look at some counter arguments and give a counter to those counter arguments. Internal evidence just means the breadcrumbs within a given book. So in Luke and Acts, what are the breadcrumbs that we can find, the clues that we can find that hint at who the author was? Because like I say with every gospel video, these books were formally anonymous, meaning in Luke and Acts, Luke never says, I, Luke, the traveling companion of Paul, wrote this gospel and wrote this narrative of documenting the acts of the apostles in the first century. He never says that. And so we have to piece that together with the internal evidence within the book, but then also the external evidence, which is kind of the historical evidence outside of the gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. So let's dive right into the internal evidence and look, what do we know about the author of Luke, Acts, and why does it make us think that it is Luke? So here's some facts that we know about the author just by looking at the books, Luke and Acts themselves. One, highly educated. This author has fantastic Greek. Even if his style isn't highly literary, it is exceptional Greek. We know he's not an apostle and not an eyewitness of Jesus, because he claims that. He says that at the beginning of Luke, that he was not an eyewitness to the account, but he collected eyewitness testimonies and sources in order to present this gospel to Theophilus. Whether Theophilus was his sponsor or it's representative of a community that Luke is writing to, that's not really important, but Luke's claim is that he's gathering eyewitness testimonies in order to present them in an orderly manner. And so we know that he's not an apostle or an eyewitness to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Now, he was an eyewitness to, this is number 3, he was an eyewitness to part of what he wrote about in Acts, because he uses we when Paul is traveling to certain places. In, I believe there's 4 different we passages in Acts, and they're lengthy passages that are narrating Paul's journey in certain areas, and the narrator is saying, we went here, we went there. And so it tells us that at some point, Luke, the author of Luke and Acts, is actually a traveling companion of Paul. There's some counter arguments to that. I'll get to that at the end, but that's the data. So this author knows the Old Testament and the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, extremely well, constantly quoting it, often using the Greek translation. So, and that's another point, is we're fairly certain that this author is Greek. He's a Gentile, not Jewish, which is really important. That's why his Greek is so good. 6, he thinks very highly of Paul. This is very, very clear from just reading through Acts, is we see that Paul is this author's hero in a sense. 7, I already said, he's likely a Gentile because of his Greek. And then even in Acts 1:19, when he says Aramaic, he says their language, referring to someone else. So it's not his own language, and the Jews spoke Aramaic, so he's saying their language, just hints at the fact that he's a Gentile. The author actually uses a lot of medical language as well. So he uses, instead of fever, Matthew and Mark use a term for someone who's sick, and they say, this person had a fever. The same story that Luke is recounting, he says a high fever. So it's it's more precise, and that it's not conclusive that it says, oh, the author must be a physician, must be a doctor. But if we believe that the author's a physician, and then we see stuff like this, we're like, oh, that makes complete sense. And that's what we see. Luke, being a physician, would have written medical terms in a little bit more precision than, say, Matthew or Mark, who are just recalling the event. They're not too worried about the finer details of the medical side of things, but Luke is being precise here. And then 9, this author has extremely detailed knowledge of weather and geographical patterns in the ancient Near East. Like it's strangely accurate, and historians even use some of Acts to understand weather patterns from 2,000 years ago. They don't have anything like the book of Acts that's that precise in its weather pattern articulation. And so that tells us that whoever was writing it for at least those sections of the story that have the we passages, it's most likely that he was an eyewitness to these accounts because he's recalling the actual weather. For instance, on the trip to Rome, from Jerusalem to Rome, there's a shipwreck and there's a lot of weather things that are going on. And Luke, the author of Luke Acts, is depicting these weather changes, weather patterns, and things like that. These are all the breadcrumbs that we get from the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, and we pull them together and we say, okay, because we see all of these different things pointing towards such an individual, Luke fits the bill in all of those. And so lastly, based on these we passages and the fact that Paul mentions Luke, among others, in his prison epistles, it makes us really confident that whoever wrote Luke and Acts was a traveling companion of Paul all the way to Rome when he was imprisoned. And so we can narrow that list way down based on who Paul has mentioned in his prison epistles. And based on all this internal evidence, along with who Paul has mentioned, the person that fits the absolute best, as I've said, is Luke the physician. And so, but that's as far as the internal evidence can take us. It can't take us all the way to certainty. Not that certainty is even possible with any historical question. I've mentioned that before. You can't get absolute certainty with historical questions. But that's not what we're going for. We're going for the most likely conclusion based on all the evidence. And so internally, we've already seen highly likely. Now let's look at the external evidence, which is very similar to Matthew, Mark, and John's external evidence for authorship. Like I've said in the other videos, there is unanimous agreement among all early Christian writers, pastors, historians, theologians, that Luke, the physician, the traveling companion of Paul, wrote Luke and Acts. There is no debate at all. And so the reason this is so important is because we look at the internal evidence and we say, okay, the internal evidence is pretty good, but it's still not a slam dunk. And because it's not a slam dunk, what we would expect if all the historians and Christian writers, if all they were going on was the internal evidence in the 2nd century, what we would expect is maybe there'd be some disagreement. Maybe among Christian circles, you would have one person claiming, oh no, I think the apostle wrote it, or I think so-and-so wrote it. But that's not the case in the 2nd century. There is unanimous agreement that Luke wrote Luke Acts, which tells us that they were going on more information than just the internal evidence. They had direct access to the 2nd generation Christians who had direct access to the apostles themselves. They would have been passing along the story that, yes, Luke, the traveling companion of Paul, wrote Luke Acts. They're not just inferring this from the internal evidence. Papias and Irenaeus are the two examples I always use because Papias, when he's writing, he's saying that he heard things from 2nd generation Christians who had heard them from, for example, John the Apostle himself. Irenaeus also says that he got his information from Polycarp, who got his information from the Apostle John. And so you have these writers who are claiming apostolic succession to this information. It's not a random Christian from the middle of nowhere who's reading the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles and says, it seems pretty reasonable that Luke wrote both of these, and then the whole church across geographical locations and time, they're all like, yeah, okay, we'll accept that. No, there would have been more debate. So the fact that there's unanimity tells us that there's more leading to this decision than just the internal evidence. The other thing that I've mentioned already that's worth repeating over and over again, because it is such an important point, is when we say that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles is formally anonymous, that's with a huge caveat. The truth is, especially the Gospel of Luke, the title, according to Luke, we don't have any manuscript evidence that says this title has not been associated with the book. To put it another way, all of the manuscripts that we have in existence, all the copies of the copies, whatever, that we have of the Gospel of Luke have the name attached according to Luke. So when people say, oh, these titles were added later, when the 4 Gospels were taken together, they were turned into one codex, and it was spread around as the 4-fold singular gospel instead of 4 different Gospels, that's when they had to attach the names. Everything that they're saying there has zero evidence. There is no evidence to support that conclusion. It's just an inference based on another inference. And that first inference is that the Gospels began circulating at around AD 125. And so that's when the names had to be attached. But they can't even prove the first thing, that's when the Gospels started circulating together. So if they can't even prove the first thing, and then they make an inference based on that first principle, that's just too many inferences stacked on it. It's just a house of cards. We need to take a fresh look at the evidence and just realize there is no evidence that these books ever were without a title. They've always had the title according to our manuscript evidence. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse with that point, but it's important because people just make these ridiculous claims, and I don't know, there's no basis for it. And lastly, with the external evidence, 1/4 of the entire New Testament is made up of Luke's writings. Luke and Acts are that long that it takes up 1/4 of all of the New Testament. And so the fact that it is universally identified as Luke being the author of this makes it highly probable that he was, because he was not an apostle. And so for people to identify a non-apostolic writer to have written a quarter of the New Testament means it's almost certainly true. They would not have made that up. There's no good reason to make that up when the early church valued apostolic writings so much. If they weren't sure who the author was, they would have made up an apostle. They would have said Matthew wrote it. They would have said Philip wrote it. They would have said one of the 11 would have written it, not Luke, who was a traveling companion of Paul, especially when Paul he already had to defend his own apostolic position. Paul had to defend his own apostleship in some of his writings. There were these super apostles who were claiming that they were better than Paul, and that Paul, he wasn't even an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, and so he couldn't be an apostle. And so he was defending his own apostleship. So why would the early church make Luke the author of a quarter of the New Testament when his closest connection to apostolic succession is Paul, not even one of the 11 who spent 3 years with Jesus? It just doesn't make sense if you're going to make it up. So it's got to be true. All of the evidence, and that's not the only argument, right? All of the evidence combined makes it most likely that Luke, the physician, the traveling companion of Paul, wrote Luke and Acts. That is the case for the traditional argument for Lucan authorship. Now, what are the counter arguments? What's the case against the traditional position? Some people want to say that these early Christian witnesses, the external evidence, is not reliable. They made it up, and everyone based their interpretation of Luke Acts on Papias. But this is, again, like I've already said, this is not a good argument because the internal evidence alone is not enough to provide that unanimity. If all Papias or Irenaeus or so-and-so were going on was the internal evidence, there would have likely been disagreements on who the author was in the 2nd century, especially with how prone they were to wanting apostolic influence on every book in the New Testament. It's not just the claims from external evidence, but it's really the unanimity that tells us that these external witnesses are so valuable and to be trusted. So second, some people want to say that the we passages that I mentioned in Acts refer to something else, that either the author of, so let's just say Luke for now, they say Luke got these we passages from a written source that was an eyewitness account of those events, and he just copied the source directly. But what we see in Luke Acts is he has such good Greek and such good writing style. He's constantly conforming his sources into his own flow. But if in these 4 instances, for some reason, he keeps the wooden language of the source, that just doesn't make any sense based on the holistic writing style of Luke in Luke Acts. He's very fluid in using his sources. He's not doing direct quotations. That's a very, very much a 21st century idea. He was just incorporating his sources into his own narrative flow very fluidly. So that would, if he quoted a source and used the source pronouns of we in his own book, even though it wasn't referring to him, that would go against all of his style in both books. So it really doesn't make sense. And then the biggest critique, and the one that deserves the most attention, is that people claim that the historical representation of Paul in Acts is radically different and contradictory from the depiction of his own historical accounts of his life, say in like Galatians, all his autobiographical things that we can find in his letters. People want to say, oh, that contradicts. Acts and Paul's own writings contradict each other on this point, along with theology. They want to say the Paul of Acts and the Paul in his letters have different theological emphases, and so they're contradictory. So that's kind of the biggest claim of why it couldn't have possibly been Luke himself who wrote Luke Acts, because the Paul in Acts and the Paul in Paul's own letters are very different. But first and foremost, these historical discrepancies have been blown way out of proportion. There are 0 contradictions. Let me just say that again. There are 0 historical contradictions between Acts and Paul's own writings. There are discrepancies, but there are reasonable explanations for every single one of them. I really won't get into the details because it's not worth it, but most of it revolves around Paul's different trips to Jerusalem. I believe Paul is the one who only mentions 3 of his trips to Jerusalem, whereas Luke in Acts mentions 5 trips. And that's fine. I mean, Paul is writing letters to people with specific purposes. We can't expect him to want to write an entire autobiographical history of himself in a letter that's designed to like build up a church. That's not the point of letters, right? Acts is more history, and so we would expect it to be more holistic in its historical representation. And then theologically, the theological side of things, they want to say four or five different theological discrepancies. In Acts, Paul affirms nature as a primer to the gospel, whereas in Romans, he kind of makes it seem like it's only a negative thing that can be accomplished with nature. You can only know that you're going to be judged by looking at nature, so natural theology. 2, Paul seems to be loyal to the law in Acts, whereas he's very hard against the law in, say, Galatians or Romans. In Acts, you don't see anything related to the idea of union with Christ or the substitutionary atonement of Christ in Acts, but you do see that in his letters. 4, he doesn't really preach on eschatology. In Acts, he doesn't preach on the end hope, end times, or the end hope of the gospel when we are all resurrected and reunited with Christ. But he obviously does in his letters. And then he cares far more about church government in Acts than he does in his letters. So I'll just take these one by one. Number 1, obviously, is not contradictory. He can have a positive aspect of natural theology in Acts and still say, okay, in the details, what does natural theology actually do for us? It shows that the invisible attributes and the eternality of God exists, that those are by no means contradictory, and those can both actually be seen as primers to the gospel. Number 2 just denies how nuanced Paul views the law. Galatians, he goes down hard on the law, but in Romans, he sees the law as having beneficial aspects. And in Acts, he's dealing with real life situations where he has to manage relationships. And like in 1 Corinthians, Paul clearly says, to a Jew, I became a Jew. That's very much in line with what we see in Acts, where he has Timothy get circumcised in order to minister to the Jews. No contradiction there at all. In fact, it helps us just see how nuanced Paul really is, and it gives us a better picture, a fuller understanding of Paul's theology of the law. It's not a contradictory, but a more nuanced, a more natural understanding. Numbers 3 and 4, they're just overstated because it inherently within this critique, it denies Paul's authorship of certain letters where he does talk about that, right? So we see it in Acts, and then we see it in the letters that these critics are denying Paul wrote. For instance, Ephesians is a very good example where all of those themes exist. And as far as the eschatological front, he's not preaching end times because he's being highly evangelistic. The end times hope is more geared towards Christians, whereas like forgiveness of sins is kind of the front door into Christianity. And so he's preaching very evangelistically in Acts, but then he's writing to Christians in his letters. So of course there's going to be differences there because it's a different audience. Just like when I make YouTube videos, depending on the topic, I'm going to frame it and I'm going to record it in different ways because I have different audiences. And lastly, there's this existential interpretation of Paul's theology that if you affirm that, that's what makes it so hard to see the Paul from Acts. Because when you look at him from an existential point of view in his letters, and then you apply that to Acts, you realize actually the existential theological interpretation is wrong, because Acts gives you a more nuanced view of who Paul actually is. And so seeing his writings and his actions is extremely helpful in actually understanding Paul as a whole. And instead of crying wolf and saying, oh, these are two different Pauls, you should probably just check your own interpretation of Scripture and realize that they are nuanced and they are synergistic. So in summary, external evidence, internal evidence. When you bring it all together, it's extremely likely that Luke the physician, the traveling companion of Paul, wrote Luke and Acts. We know almost nothing about his background except for what we can extract from the books themselves. So all of the different things that I mentioned at the beginning, that's really all we know about Luke. We don't know anything else about his background, but we are about as certain as one can be with historical questions that Luke wrote Luke and Acts. All right, that's 3 down, 24 to go. Next up, the Gospel of John. See y'all then. Peace.